Sometimes the scariest horror stories don't begin with ghosts screaming in the dark. They begin with something far quieter. A trip, a memory, a place connected to someone you loved. And when I first saw the trailer for Hokum, the upcoming supernatural horror film from director Damian McCarthy, it immediately felt like one of those stories where grief slowly turns into something far more terrifying. At first glance, Hokum sounds like a simple premise. A writer travels to Ireland to scatter the ashes of his parents in a place that meant something special to them. That's it. No elaborate mythology, no complicated setup, just a man honoring the memory of his family. But horror fans know exactly how dangerous a simple premise can be, because sometimes the quietest stories hide the darkest secrets. The film stars Adam Scott as Ohm Borman, a novelist dealing with the loss of his parents. If you've followed Scott's career, you probably know him best from comedies like Parks and Recreation or Party Down. But over the years, he has quietly built a fascinating career jumping between genres. More recently, his performance in the SCIFI series Severance showed just how comfortable he can be in darker, more unsettling material, and Hokum might be the darkest role he's taken yet. In the film, Ohm travels to a remote inn somewhere deep in rural Ireland. It's not just any location. This place holds emotional significance for his parents. It was somewhere they had once dreamed of returning to. A place connected to memories, love, and unfinished plans. So Ohm decides to finish that journey for them, but almost immediately after arriving, something feels wrong. The hotel itself looks quiet, almost too quiet. The kind of place where time seems to move differently. The kind of building where every hallway feels like it might be hiding something just beyond your sight. And the more Ohm explores the property, the more the atmosphere begins to change. The trailer released by Neon doesn't reveal much about the actual plot, but what it does show is incredibly effective. Instead of explaining everything, it leans into unsettling imagery. Long, silent corridors, strange glances from other guests, doors that led into darkness instead of rooms. At one point, Ohm begins hearing whispers about something that supposedly haunts the honeymoon suite of the inn, a witch, and if that sounds familiar, it's because the concept taps into something that horror has explored for decades. Writers confronting the very horrors they once imagined. Stephen King famously used that idea in The Shining, where a writer retreats into isolation only to find himself losing control of reality. King explored a similar theme again in 1408, where another author investigating haunted locations becomes trapped in a nightmare he can't escape. Hokum seems to follow that tradition while adding its own eerie twist. Ohm isn't just staying at a strange hotel. He's staying in a place filled with stories. Stories about a witch that supposedly roams the honeymoon suite. Stories that may or may not be real, but the more time he spends there, the harder it becomes to ignore the possibility that those stories might actually be true. One of the most unsettling moments hinted at in the trailer involves a sudden disappearance connected to the inn. Someone vanishes without explanation, forcing Ohm to confront the possibility that something supernatural is happening around him. And once that door opens, the story becomes something much bigger than a simple memorial trip. Director Damian McCarthy is quickly becoming one of the most interesting voices in modern horror. If you've seen his earlier films, you probably know exactly what kind of atmosphere he likes to create. His 2020 film Caveat introduced audiences to a story about a drifter hired to watch over a woman in an isolated house. The twist? He had to remain chained during the entire job. It was an incredibly simple concept, but the tension came from the way McCarthy used space, silence, and slow-building dread. Then came Oddity, which pushed his visual style even further. That film gained attention for its haunting imagery and careful pacing, earning an impressive critical response and proving that McCarthy has a unique ability to craft unsettling horror without relying on cheap jump scares. Now with Hokum, he appears to be expanding the scale of his storytelling, while still keeping the eerie rural atmosphere that defined his earlier work, and that's where Neon enters the picture. The studio has been making a serious name for itself in the horror genre. Over the past few years, Neon has helped bring several distinctive horror films to audiences, including viral hits like Longlegs and other bold genre projects that prioritize atmosphere over formula. So, the partnership between McCarthy and Neon makes a lot of sense. Both seem interested in horror that feels personal, unsettling, and slightly unpredictable in Hokum, that combination could be especially powerful because the film isn't just about a haunted location. It's also about grief. Ohm arrives at the inn carrying the emotional weight of losing his parents. The act of scattering their ashes is meant to bring closure. Instead, it pulls him deeper into a place where the past refuses to stay buried, and that emotional vulnerability might make him the perfect target for whatever is haunting the property. As the trailer unfolds, we begin seeing flashes of disturbing imagery, strange figures, unnatural shadows, moments where Ohm opens doors only to find darkness staring back at him. There's a feeling that the building itself might be watching, and the longer Ohm stays, the more he begins questioning whether the stories about the witch are just folklore, or something much more real. The supporting cast adds another layer of intrigue. Actors like Peter Coonan, Austin Emilio, David Wilmot, Florence Ordesh, and Will O'Connell appear throughout the trailer as guests and staff members of the inn. Each one seems to know more about the place than they're willing to admit, which raises an interesting question. How much of what's happening is supernatural, and how much of it is something else entirely? That mystery is part of what makes Hokum so intriguing. Even the title itself is curious. The word Hokum usually refers to something fake or exaggerated, something meant to trick an audience into believing something that isn't real. So the title alone suggests a possibility. What if the haunting isn't exactly what it seems? Or worse, what if it is? Another interesting detail about the film is its festival debut. Hokum is scheduled to premiere at the SXSW Film Festival before arriving in theaters on May 1, 2026. Festivals like SXSW have become important, launching pads for horror films that rely more on atmosphere and originality than massive studio budgets. And, if early reactions follow the pattern of McCarthy's previous films, Hokum could quickly become a favorite among genre fans, especially if the director once again delivers the kind of slow-burning dread that made Caveat and Oddity so memorable. Of course, Adam Scott's presence adds another layer of curiosity. Watching him move deeper into the horror genre after years of comedy roles makes Hokum feel like an unexpected but fascinating step in his career, and honestly, seeing him walk through dark hallways searching for answers while something unseen watches from the shadows feels like the perfect setup for a psychological nightmare. But here's the real question. Is Ohm simply encountering a haunted location, or is he slowly becoming part of the story himself? Because if horror has taught us anything, it's that writers who investigate supernatural stories often end up trapped inside them. Hokum might start with a man trying to honor his parents, but by the time the film reaches its final act, it may turn into something much more disturbing, a confrontation with grief, a haunted past, and possibly a witch that has been waiting far longer than anyone realized. The film arrives in theaters on May 1, 2026, and if Damian McCarthy's previous work is any indication, this could easily become one of the most atmospheric horror films of the year. Now I'm curious what you think about this one. Do you think the witch haunting the inn is real? Or could Hokum be hiding a completely different kind of twist? Either way, if you enjoy exploring new horror films and breaking down the stories behind them, stick around because there are always more mysteries waiting in the dark.